Today we're going to be talking about genetics, so I need you to grab your notebook or whatever you take notes on. Your title can be just genetics. So this unit we're going to be talking about genes, how they influence our traits, all of that good stuff. So our goal today is to be able to use the 7 steps to solve a Punnett square and also be able to predict the offspring, the kids, for monohybrid crosses. That means we're going to do Punnett squares with one mono trait. Okay, so monohybrid cross means one trait. You don't need to write this down, but because we're talking about genetics, I figured we should talk about what the heck is genetics. So genetics is the study of how traits are passed down from parents to kids. So a long time ago, in the 1800s, scientists were looking at parents, they looked at kids, and they were like, hey, you know, your kids look a lot like the parents. And they wanted to know why. Why is this happening? You know, the parents must pass down something to their kids. They didn't know what it was. They didn't know about DNA yet. Remember, the structure of DNA wasn't discovered until the 1950s. So they did a lot of experiments, but they didn't know that it was DNA. And so this is how the field of genetics started, is by doing these experiments. And they didn't do them on humans. They did them on plants and bacteria. And because they couldn't look at DNA, they looked at the physical appearance. Okay, so they would look at, oh, this plant has yellow peas, this plant has green peas. What happens if we breed them? What color peas is the baby plant going to have? So from this, we get our study of genetics. You'll notice in the word genetics, we have the word gene. Go ahead and write this definition down. A gene is a section of DNA that codes for a protein. You'll remember that DNA makes up chromosomes. Remember, you got 46 chromosomes in each one of your cells? So this DNA has different regions, okay? And each of these regions is a gene. So chromosomes have hundreds to thousands of genes on them, okay? They're made out of hundreds of thousands of genes. One gene might code for your eye color. One gene might code for whether or not you have curly hair or straight hair. Okay, and remember, these genes are coding for a protein, and it's that protein that's determining the color or the waviness, or it might be creating a protein that we can't really see, like insulin that helps you process sugar, or it might be creating an enzyme. An enzyme is a protein that helps you digest your food. So some of these proteins we can see, some of them we can't. Now, up to you if you want to write this, but a trait is a characteristic, okay? So you have lots of traits. Maybe you've got curly hair, you've got long eyelashes, you're 5'7". Those are all traits or characteristics. Our genes, or our DNA, determine our traits. And again, some of these things we can easily see, like our eye color or our hair color. Some of these things we can't see very easily. Okay, like the proteins that are being created to help make up our cell membranes. You don't have to write this down. This is just a reminder that you've got 2 sets of chromosomes in your body, in every single cell in your body, 2 sets. One set came from mom, so 23 from mom. One set from dad, 23 from dad. But the problem is, mom didn't give you the same exact genes as dad. They're different. So our big question is, like, what if your dad gives you a gene for blue eyes and your mom gives you a gene for brown eyes? What color eyes are you going to have? We can figure this out using genetics, okay? So in order to learn about genetics, we first have to talk about dominant and recessive. I know you guys talked about this in 7th grade, so this will be a little bit of review, but you can go ahead and write down this definition. Dominant, a trait that shows up no matter what other gene it's paired with. It's symbolized by a capital letter. So whenever we have a dominant gene or a dominant trait, we use a capital letter. I like to think of it as the guy that's overpowering the smaller guy here. A dominant gene is going to overpower any other gene that it's with. You don't have to write this down, but just a word of caution. Dominant doesn't mean that it's the most common in the population. We might think, oh, because it's dominant and it overpowers the other genes, it's always going to be super popular, super common. That's not really the case. For example, the gene for Huntington's disease is dominant. But I'm guessing you probably don't know anybody with Huntington's disease. Okay, so Huntington's disease causes kind of your muscles to kind of waste away. It's a progressive disease. It gets worse and worse over time. They don't really have a cure for it. But it is caused by a dominant gene. So just because it's dominant doesn't mean it's super common. Write this down. A recessive trait is a trait that only shows up if there is no dominant gene. So this is symbolized by a lowercase letter. It's only going to show up, the trait's only going to show up if we don't have a big dominant gene overpowering it. So you're going to try here. So brown eyes are dominant to blue eyes. So let's take a look. Big B, big B. What color eyes is this person going to have? Brown or blue? That's right, they're going to have brown eyes. What about big B, little b? If this person has a big B and a little b, are they going to have brown or blue eyes? They're going to have brown eyes. What about little b, little b? Yeah, they're going to have blue eyes. Okay, so remember, each person has two genes, two copies of every gene. One came from mom, one came from dad. Now, scientists have these big fancy words that they're going to use, and they're going to try to trip you up. You know how in word problems in math, sometimes they look a little scary? Well, we're going to have some word problems here in science, in biology. And they're going to use these big fancy words to try to trip you up. But you're going to be like, no, you're not going to trip me up. I know these definitions. So one definition, and I need you to write this down. One thing they're going to say is, oh, the parent is homozygous, or the parent is purebred. This means they have two of the same genes, or two of the same letters. Remember, each person has two copies of each gene. So if they're homozygous, that means they have the same, either two dominant or two recessive. Purebred's another way to say this. So if in this word problem they say, oh, the parent is homozygous dominant, that means they've got two capital letters, or two versions of the dominant trait. If they say, oh, this person's homozygous recessive, that means they've got two recessive genes, or two lowercase letters. Now, what if they've got two different letters? Well, then they're heterozygous or hybrid. Heterozygous means they've got two different letters, so like a capital and a lowercase. So in these problems, they'll say, oh, the mom is heterozygous. That just means they've got a big A and a little a. All right, so let's take a look at this. Green leaves are dominant over yellow leaves. Big G is green, little g is yellow. What letters represent a homozygous dominant individual? All right, what letters? We need to have two letters. All right, homozygous means two of the same. Dominant means two capitals, so it'd be big G, big G. What about homozygous recessive? Homozygous means two of the same letters. Recessive means lowercase, so that'd be little g, little g. What about heterozygous? That means two different, so they'd be big G, little g. All right, we have two more definitions, and then we'll be done writing definitions here. Sometimes they'll say in these word problems, what's the phenotype? Phenotype means physical appearance. Okay, like for example, 3 out of the 4 kids have brown hair. That's their physical appearance. Genotype are the letters. So if I say, what's the genotype of the kids? You'll say, they're big B, big B. Or, they're little b, little b. Phenotype and physical appearance sound similar, right? Genotype and gene letters sound similar. So that's an easy way to remember that. So how do we solve Punnett square problems? The type of problem we're going to do today, and you don't need to write this down, it's called monohybrid. And it just means a genetic problem with only one trait. Mono means one. Okay. Hybrid means to kind of like cross two together. So let's take a look at this problem. Brown eyes are dominant to blue eyes. Cross a hybrid brown-eyed male with a heterozygous brown-eyed female. Remember how I said they were going to use those big fancy words to try to trip you up? Don't get overwhelmed, okay? We got this. So step 1, determine which trait is dominant and which trait is recessive. So can you tell me, go ahead, which trait is dominant, which trait is recessive? Yeah, brown eyes are dominant, blue eyes are recessive. How do we know? It says it right up top. Blue eyes are dominant, or brown eyes are dominant to blue eyes. Beautiful. Step 2, we've got to pick a letter that's going to represent the dominant and recessive genes. Okay? You can pick whatever letter you want. But remember, we've got a capital letter for the dominant trait and a lowercase letter here. A lot of times I tell my students to pick a letter that looks different as a capital than as a lowercase. So in this case, big B and a little b. Notice how if we were to have like a C, a capital C and a lowercase c, they'd look very similar. Well, big B and little b look very different. So a lot of times I tell them, make sure you choose something that's going to look different. Step 3, determine the parent's genes. Okay? Determine the parent's genes. So it says hybrid brown-eyed male. Well, what's hybrid mean? Remember that means two different letters? So the dad is going to have two different letters. It's going to have a big B and a little b. And the mom is heterozygous. Hey, that also means two different letters. So mom's going to be big B, little b as well. Easy. All right, step 4, determine the genes that are going to go into each sperm and egg. Now this is important. Remember when dad passes down his genes to the sperm when he makes the sperm in meiosis? He doesn't give all of his chromosomes. He only gives half. So he's not going to give both of his B's to his sperm. Only one of his genes is going to go into each sperm. So we've got to figure out, well, what are the different possibilities he could have for the gene letters that are going into the sperm? Well, he could either have a big B going into one sperm or a little b going into a sperm. Those are the two options for sperm. And what about for the female? Well, she's only going to give half of hers, so she could either have an egg with a big B or an egg with a little b, because those are the letters that she has. Now remember, a sperm and an egg are going to fertilize each other. So what are the different possible combinations we can get? That's what a Punnett square is for. Okay, so we put dad's sperm, we put those on one side. Dad's sperm letters have to stick together. We can't put like one of dad's letters on the side, one on the top. They gotta stick together. Mom's are gonna go on the other side. Now, it doesn't matter if you put dad's on the top and mom's on the side, or, mom's on the top, dad's on the side. Either way will work, as long as mom's letters stick together, dad's letters stick together. Now we just fill in the Punnett square. Okay, so here we've got big B, big B, big B, little b, big B, little b, and little b, little b. now we need to figure out the offspring. How many of the offspring are going to have brown eyes? Remember, if they have at least one capital letter, B, capital B stands for brown, so they're going to have brown eyes. So how many will have brown eyes? 3 out of 4. How many are going to have blue eyes? They need to have 2 little b's in order to have blue eyes. 1 out of 4. Awesome. 3 out of 4 or 75%, 1 out of 4 or 25%. How many have the genotype big B, big B? We just look at our squares, that's 1 out of 4. How many have big B, little b? 2, 2 out of 4. How many have little b, 1 out of 4. So now you just did the genotypes, the letters, and the phenotypes, the physical appearances.